The winter of 1978 hit northern Montana harder than anyone expected. Snow fell for 3 straight days, turning the world into a white wasteland where nothing moved except the wind. The temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Thomas Whitehorse pulled his worn jacket tighter as he walked through the small town of Glacier Falls. He was a member of the Apache tribe, visiting from Arizona to see his sick grandmother who lived on the nearby reservation. People stared at him as he passed by the main street shops. Some whispered behind his back. Others crossed the street to avoid him. Thomas had grown used to these reactions over the years. In 1978, prejudice against Native Americans was still common in many small towns. Store owners watched him carefully when he shopped. Restaurant servers were often rude. Some people acted like he didn't belong there, even though his family had lived on this land for generations before the town even existed. But Thomas didn't let their attitudes bother him too much. He had more important things to worry about. His grandmother was dying, and he wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. She had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. She taught him the old Apache ways, the stories of his people, and most importantly, she taught him about kindness and helping others. The blizzard started on his 3rd day in town. Thomas was staying in a small motel on the edge of Glacier Falls. The wind howled outside his window all night, rattling the glass and making the building shake. By morning, the snow was piled up to the windows. The roads were completely blocked and no cars could move. Thomas tried to get to the reservation to check on his grandmother, but it was impossible. The snow was too deep and the wind was too strong. He would have to wait for the storm to pass. He spent the day in his motel room, listening to the radio for weather updates and worrying about his grandmother. The radio announcer kept warning people to stay inside. The temperature was dangerous and visibility was almost zero. Anyone caught outside could freeze to death in minutes. The town's emergency services were overwhelmed, and rescue crews couldn't reach people who needed help. As the 2nd day of the blizzard continued, Thomas heard something that made him feel sick with worry. The radio reported that the power was out at the reservation. Without heat, the elderly residents were in serious danger. Thomas knew his grandmother was probably cold and scared, but there was nothing he could do to help her. He paced around his small motel room, feeling helpless and frustrated. Outside, the storm raged on with no sign of stopping. The wind sounded like wild animals howling, and the snow kept falling harder and harder. Thomas had never seen weather this bad, even during the harsh winters he remembered from his childhood. That evening, as Thomas sat by his window watching the snow fall, he heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint at first, almost lost in the wind. But as he listened more carefully, he realized it was someone calling for help. The voice was weak and desperate, coming from somewhere outside in the deadly cold. Thomas looked out his window but couldn't see anything through the swirling snow. The voice came again, closer this time. Someone was out there in the blizzard, probably lost and freezing. Thomas knew that person would die if they didn't get help soon. He thought about his grandmother's teachings about helping others, even when it was difficult or dangerous. She always said that a person's character was tested not when things were easy, but when they were hard. This was definitely one of those times. Thomas put on his heaviest coat and opened the motel room door. The wind immediately hit him like a physical blow, and the cold took his breath away. Snow stung his face and eyes, making it almost impossible to see. But he could still hear the voice calling for help, and he knew he had to try to find whoever was out there. The moment he stepped outside, Thomas realized how dangerous this was. The cold was beyond anything he had ever experienced. His breath froze in the air and his exposed skin started to sting within seconds. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked him over, and the snow was so thick he could barely see his own hands. But someone needed help, and Thomas couldn't ignore that. He pulled his coat hood up and started walking toward where he thought the voice was coming from, knowing that every step he took into the storm was a step that might save a life or cost him his own. Thomas struggled through the deep snow, following the sound of the desperate voice. Each step was a battle against the wind and cold. The snow came up to his knees, and sometimes he sank in even deeper. His feet were already getting numb, and his face felt like it was being slapped with ice. The voice called out again, and this time Thomas could tell it was a woman. She sounded terrified and exhausted. He pushed forward, using his hands to feel his way through the white darkness. The wind was so loud he had to strain to hear her calls for help. After what felt like forever, Thomas saw a dark shape in the snow ahead of him. As he got closer, he could see it was a car that had slid off the road and crashed into a snowbank. The car was almost completely buried, with only part of the roof and one window visible. Thomas reached the car and looked through the window. Inside, he saw a young woman with blonde hair. She was hugging herself and shivering violently. Her lips looked blue from the cold and her eyes were wide with fear. When she saw Thomas, she started crying with relief. The woman tried to roll down the window, but it was frozen shut. Thomas used his fist to break the ice around the door handle and managed to pull the door open. A blast of cold air rushed into the car, making the woman gasp. "Please help me," she whispered through chattering teeth. "I've been stuck here since yesterday. My car won't start and I can't feel my feet anymore." Thomas could see that the woman was in serious trouble. She had been in the cold car for over 24 hours without heat. Her skin was pale and she was showing signs of hypothermia. If she stayed there much longer, she would probably die. "Can you walk?" Thomas asked, leaning close to the car so she could hear him over the wind. The woman tried to move her legs, but she was too weak and cold. "I don't think so," she said. "I can't feel anything below my waist." Thomas realized he would have to carry her. This made the situation much more dangerous for both of them. He was already struggling against the cold and wind. Carrying another person would slow him down and use up more of his energy. But he couldn't leave her there to die. "I'm going to get you out of here," Thomas told her. "But we have to move fast. Can you put your arms around my neck?" The woman nodded weakly. Thomas helped her out of the car and lifted her onto his back. She was heavier than he expected, and her wet clothes made her even harder to carry. But Thomas had worked construction jobs for years and was strong enough to manage. The journey back to the motel was the longest and most difficult walk of Thomas's life. The woman's weight made him sink deeper into the snow with every step. The wind seemed to be getting stronger, and the cold was so intense that his hands started to lose feeling even through his gloves. Several times Thomas stumbled and almost fell. Each time he had to stop and catch his breath before continuing. The woman on his back was barely conscious now, and Thomas worried that she might be dying. He could feel her getting heavier as her body became more limp. Thomas's own body was reaching its limits. His legs felt like they were made of wood, and his breathing was becoming labored. The cold was draining his energy faster than he had expected. He started to wonder if they would both die out there in the storm. But Thomas thought about his grandmother and the Apache teachings about never giving up when someone needed help. He thought about the stories she told him about Apache warriors who endured incredible hardships to protect their people. Those stories gave him the strength to keep going. As they struggled through the blizzard, Thomas began to worry about something else. When he got back to the motel with this woman, what would the people in town think? He was a Native American man carrying an unconscious white woman. In 1978, this could cause serious problems for him. Thomas knew that some people in town already distrusted him because of his race. If they saw him with this woman, they might think he had hurt her or kidnapped her. Even though he was trying to save her life, some people might not believe his story. This could lead to accusations, police involvement, or even violence against him. But as Thomas looked at the woman's pale face and blue lips, he knew that worrying about what people might think was less important than saving her life. She was someone's daughter, maybe someone's wife or mother. She deserved to live, regardless of what problems it might cause for him later. Thomas pushed these worries out of his mind and focused on getting back to the motel. Step by step, he fought his way through the storm, carrying the woman toward safety. The wind howled around them like a living thing trying to drag them back into the frozen darkness. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Thomas saw the lights of the motel through the swirling snow. He had never been so happy to see a building in his life, but he also knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Once he got the woman inside and warmed up, he would have to figure out how to explain the situation to the authorities without getting himself into trouble. Thomas burst through the motel room door carrying the half-conscious woman. His fingers were so numb he could barely turn the doorknob. Once inside, he gently laid her on his bed and immediately turned up the heat as high as it would go. The woman was in terrible condition. Her skin was white and waxy. Her breathing was slow and shallow, and she wasn't responding when Thomas spoke to her. He had seen hypothermia before during his time working outdoors, and he knew she was in serious danger. Thomas quickly started removing her wet clothes. knowing that the frozen fabric would continue to steal heat from her body. This made him uncomfortable, but it was necessary to save her life. He replaced her wet clothes with dry blankets from the motel closet, wrapping her up as tightly as possible. Next, Thomas filled the bathtub with lukewarm water. He knew from his grandmother's teachings about treating cold injuries that hot water could actually hurt someone with severe hypothermia. The water needed to be warm, but not hot, to slowly bring her body temperature back to normal. Carefully, Thomas carried the woman to the bathroom and lowered her into the tub, keeping the blankets around her. The warm water began to steam slightly in the cold bathroom air. At first, there was no reaction from the woman. Thomas started to worry that he might be too late, but after a few minutes, the woman began to stir. She made small moaning sounds and her eyelids fluttered. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. She was going to survive. As the woman slowly regained consciousness, Thomas faced a new problem. He realized he needed to call for medical help, but he was afraid of what might happen when the authorities arrived. Here he was, a Native American man with an unconscious white woman in his motel room. Even though he had saved her life, he knew some people might not see it that way. Thomas thought about the stories his grandmother had told him about Apache people who had been falsely accused of crimes they didn't commit. In the old days, Native Americans were often blamed for things they didn't do, simply because of prejudice and fear. Even in 1978, Thomas knew this kind of thinking still existed in many places. But the woman needed proper medical care, and Thomas couldn't provide that. He picked up the phone and called the local emergency services, knowing that he was taking a risk but also knowing it was the right thing to do. "Emergency services," a voice answered. "I need medical help," Thomas said. "I found a woman who was trapped in her car during the blizzard. She has hypothermia and needs to get to a hospital." "What's your location?" the dispatcher asked. Thomas gave them the motel address and room number. The dispatcher said they would send paramedics as soon as possible, but warned that it might take a while because of the storm conditions. While they waited, Thomas continued to care for the woman. He made hot tea and helped her take small sips when she was alert enough. He talked to her softly, trying to keep her awake and focused. Slowly, color began to return to her face and lips. "What's your name?" Thomas asked when she seemed more aware of her surroundings. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Collins. Thank you for helping me. I thought I was going to die." "You're safe now," Thomas told her. "Help is coming." Sarah looked around the motel room, seeming confused. "How did I get here?" "The last thing I remember was being in my car, and it was so cold." Thomas explained how he had heard her calling for help and carried her back to the motel. As he told the story, Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You saved my life," she said. "You went out in that storm to help me, even though you didn't know me." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Thomas replied, though he knew that wasn't necessarily true. Many people would have stayed safely inside during such a dangerous storm. Sarah shook her head. "No, not everyone would have risked their own life for a stranger." "Why did you do it?" Thomas thought about his grandmother's teachings. "My grandmother always told me that helping others is the most important thing a person can do. She said that's what makes us human." As they talked, Thomas learned that Sarah was a nurse who had been driving to the hospital when the storm hit. She had gotten lost in the blizzard and crashed her car while trying to find her way. She had been trapped for almost 36 hours. "I have to tell you something," Sarah said, looking serious. "When the paramedics get here, some people might ask questions about why I'm in your room. I want you to know that I'll tell them exactly what happened. You're a hero, and I won't let anyone say otherwise." Thomas felt grateful for her words, but he was still worried. He knew that even with Sarah's testimony, some people might still be suspicious. The combination of his race and the circumstances could lead to problems. About an hour later, they heard sirens approaching through the storm. Thomas opened the door as the paramedics arrived, followed by a police officer. The paramedics immediately went to work checking Sarah's condition, while the police officer looked around the room with a suspicious expression. "What exactly happened here?" the officer asked Thomas, his hand resting on his gun belt. Before Thomas could answer, Sarah spoke up from the stretcher where the paramedics were examining her. "This man saved my life," she said firmly. "I was trapped in my car and would have died if he hadn't rescued me." The officer looked skeptical. "And you just happened to find her in the storm?" "I heard her calling for help," Thomas explained. "I couldn't just leave her out there to die." The officer continued to ask questions, and Thomas could tell he was looking for holes in the story. But Sarah kept backing up everything Thomas said, and the paramedics confirmed that her condition was consistent with being trapped in a car during the blizzard. The police officer, whose name tag read Deputy Morrison, continued his questioning with obvious suspicion. He was a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and cold gray eyes that kept moving between Thomas and Sarah. Thomas could feel the tension in the room growing thicker with each question. "Let me get this straight," Deputy Morrison said, pulling out a notepad. "You're telling me you went out in a -40 blizzard in the dark, just because you thought you heard someone calling for help?" "That's exactly what happened," Thomas replied calmly, though his heart was racing. He had dealt with suspicious police officers before and knew that getting angry or defensive would only make things worse. "And how do we know you didn't cause this woman's accident in the first place?" Morrison asked, his voice getting harder. "Maybe you forced her off the road and then decided to play hero when you realized she might die." Sarah tried to sit up on the stretcher, her face flushed with anger despite her weakened condition. "That's ridiculous," she said loudly. "I've never seen this man before in my life. I crashed my car because of the storm and he saved me. If you want to arrest someone, arrest the blizzard." One of the paramedics, a young woman with kind eyes, looked up from checking Sarah's blood pressure. "Officer, this woman has severe hypothermia. Her core body temperature is still dangerously low. She's been exposed to extreme cold for at least 30 hours. Her story is completely consistent with her medical condition." But Deputy Morrison wasn't satisfied. "I've seen cases where kidnappers keep their victims in cold places to make them weak and compliant. Maybe this Indian thought he could have some fun with a white woman and then claim he rescued her when things went wrong." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. The racist assumption behind Morrison's theory was exactly what Thomas had feared. He felt his face burn with anger and humiliation, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting upset now would only make Morrison more suspicious. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Sarah said, her voice shaking with fury. "This man risked his life to save me, and you're treating him like a criminal because of his race. That's disgusting." "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job," Morrison replied. "We have to investigate all possibilities. Native Americans have a history of violence in this area." Thomas felt something inside him snap. The centuries of prejudice and false accusations against his people came flooding back. He thought about all the Apache warriors who had been hunted down and killed based on lies and fear. He thought about his own ancestors who had been forced from their lands because white settlers didn't trust them. But then Thomas remembered his grandmother's voice, telling him that anger and hatred only create more anger and hatred. She had taught him that the best way to fight prejudice was through dignity and truth, not through violence or hatred. "Deputy Morrison," Thomas said quietly, "I understand you're doing your job, but I'm telling you the truth. I heard this woman calling for help and I couldn't ignore it. That's all that happened here." The second paramedic, an older man with graying hair, finished loading Sarah onto the stretcher. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately," he said. "Her condition is stabilizing, but she needs proper medical care." As they prepared to take Sarah away, she grabbed Thomas's hand. "What's your name?" she asked. "I don't even know the name of the man who saved my life." "Thomas Whitehorse," he replied. "Thomas Whitehorse," Sarah repeated, as if she wanted to memorize it. "I will never forget what you did for me. Never." Deputy Morrison followed the paramedics out to the ambulance, still asking questions and taking notes. Thomas watched through his window as they loaded Sarah into the back of the ambulance and drove away through the swirling snow. Alone in his motel room again, Thomas sat on the bed where Sarah had been lying and tried to process what had just happened. He had saved a woman's life, but instead of being treated like a hero, he had been treated like a suspect. The injustice of it made his chest tight with emotion. Thomas thought about calling his grandmother to tell her what had happened, but the phone lines to the reservation were still down because of the storm. He would have to wait until the weather cleared to contact her. He knew she would be proud of what he had done, even if the local authorities weren't. The next morning, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind died down and the snow stopped falling as heavily. Thomas could see farther out his window, and he noticed that some of the roads were starting to be cleared by snowplows. Around noon, there was a knock on Thomas's door. When he opened it, he saw Deputy Morrison standing there with another police officer he didn't recognize. Morrison looked even more serious than he had the night before. "Mr. Whitehorse," Morrison said formally, "I need you to come down to the station for further questioning about last night's incident." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet," Morrison replied. "But we have some more questions and we'd prefer to conduct this interview at the station." Thomas knew he didn't have much choice. If he refused to go, it would only make him look more suspicious. He put on his coat and followed the officers to their patrol car. At the police station, Thomas was led into a small, windowless room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The walls were painted an ugly green color, and the fluorescent light overhead buzzed constantly. Morrison sat across from him with a file folder and a tape recorder. "This interview is being recorded," Morrison announced. "State your name for the record." "Thomas Whitehorse." "Mr. Whitehorse, I've been investigating your story about last night and I have some concerns. First, the motel clerk says he didn't see you leave or return with anyone. Second, we found footprints near the crashed car, but the snow has covered most of the evidence. Third, you have no witnesses to back up your story except for the alleged victim." Thomas listened to Morrison's points and realized how weak his position was. Everything Morrison said was technically true, even though the interpretation was completely wrong. The motel clerk had been inside during the storm and wouldn't have seen anything. The footprints were covered by new snow, and Sarah was the only person who knew what really happened. "I'm telling you the truth," Thomas said simply. "I saved that woman's life." Morrison leaned forward across the table. "Here's what I think really happened. I think you saw an opportunity when this woman crashed her car. Maybe you thought you could take advantage of her, and when you realized she was too sick, you decided to play the hero instead." Thomas looked directly into Morrison's eyes. "You think that because I'm Apache, don't you? You think because I'm Native American, I must be some kind of savage who would hurt an innocent woman." Morrison's face reddened slightly. "This has nothing to do with your race." "Everything about this has to do with my race," Thomas replied. "If I were a white man who saved a white woman, you'd be calling me a hero. But because I'm Apache, you assume I'm a criminal." The interrogation continued for 3 hours. Deputy Morrison asked the same questions over and over, trying to find inconsistencies in Thomas's story. He brought up Thomas's background, asking about any previous arrests or legal troubles. He questioned why Thomas was in town and how long he planned to stay. Thomas answered every question honestly and calmly, even though he felt frustrated and angry inside. He explained that he was visiting his sick grandmother on the reservation. He told Morrison about his job in Arizona and his clean criminal record. But no matter what Thomas said, Morrison seemed determined to find fault with his story. "The thing that bothers me most," Morrison said, leaning back in his chair, "is why you would risk your own life for a complete stranger. It doesn't make sense. People don't do that, especially not for someone of a different race." Thomas looked at Morrison with a mixture of sadness and pity. "Maybe that's the problem," he said quietly. "Maybe people should do that more often." Just as Morrison was preparing to ask more questions, another officer knocked on the door and entered the room. He whispered something in Morrison's ear that made the deputy's expression change completely. "We'll be right back," Morrison told Thomas, and both officers left the room. Thomas sat alone in the ugly green room wondering what was happening. He could hear voices in the hallway, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. After about 10 minutes, Morrison returned with a different attitude entirely. "Mr. Whitehorse," Morrison said, not looking directly at Thomas, "it appears that your story has been corroborated. We've received some new information that supports your account of last night's events." "What kind of information?" Thomas asked. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Collins has made a full statement from her hospital bed. She's also contacted several people who can verify her character and her account of what happened. Additionally, the hospital has confirmed that her injuries are completely consistent with being trapped in a car during the blizzard." Thomas felt a wave of relief, but he also felt angry that it had taken so long for the truth to be accepted. "So I'm free to go?" "Yes," Morrison said. "However, I want you to know that we were just doing our job. We have to investigate all suspicious circumstances." "Suspicious circumstances," Thomas repeated, like a Native American helping a white woman. Morrison's face reddened again. "Look, I don't want to argue about this. You're free to go." Thomas stood up and walked toward the door, but before leaving, he turned back to Morrison. "Deputy, I hope someday you'll realize that judging people by their race instead of their actions is what makes this world a more dangerous place for everyone. Outside the police station, Thomas was surprised to find a small crowd of people waiting for him. As he walked down the steps, a reporter from the local newspaper approached him with a notebook and camera. "Mr. Whitehorse," the reporter said, "I'm Jim Patterson from the Glacier Falls Gazette. We'd like to do a story about your heroic rescue last night. Could we ask you a few questions?" Thomas was uncomfortable with the attention, but he agreed to answer a few questions. The reporter asked about the rescue, about Thomas's background, and about his experience with the police investigation. "How do you feel about being treated as a suspect instead of a hero?" Patterson asked. Thomas thought carefully before answering. "I understand that the police have to do their job," he said diplomatically. "But I hope this situation can help people understand that helping others shouldn't be suspicious, regardless of who's doing the helping." Over the next few hours, word of Thomas's rescue spread throughout the small town. The local radio station picked up the story, and by evening it was being discussed in every restaurant and coffee shop in Glacier Falls. The reaction from the townspeople was mixed. Many people were impressed by Thomas's bravery and ashamed of how he had been treated by the police. They saw him as a hero who had risked his life to save a stranger. But others remained suspicious, convinced that there must be more to the story than what was being reported. That evening, Thomas finally managed to get through to the reservation and speak with his grandmother. The phone lines had been restored, and he was relieved to hear her voice. "Grandmother, I was so worried about you during the storm," Thomas said. "I'm fine, grandson," she replied in her gentle voice. "But I heard about what you did in town. The whole reservation is talking about it." Thomas told her the complete story, including his experience with Deputy Morrison and the police investigation. His grandmother listened quietly, occasionally making small sounds of approval or concern. "You did the right thing," she said when he finished. "You followed the Apache way of helping others even when it was dangerous for you. I'm proud of you. But grandmother, some people still don't believe me. They think I had bad intentions." "Thomas," his grandmother said firmly, "you cannot control what other people think or believe. You can only control your own actions. You saved a life, and that's what matters. The truth has a way of revealing itself even when people don't want to see it." "What if this causes more problems for our people?" Thomas asked. "What if it makes some white people more suspicious of Native Americans?" His grandmother was quiet for a moment. "Grandson, prejudice exists whether we do good things or bad things. Some people will always find reasons to hate what they don't understand. But when we do good things, when we show kindness and courage, we plant seeds that might grow into understanding someday." That night, Thomas had trouble sleeping. He kept thinking about Sarah Collins and wondering how she was doing at the hospital. He also thought about Deputy Morrison and the other people in town who viewed him with suspicion. Most of all, he thought about his grandmother's words about planting seeds of understanding. The next morning brought another surprise. There was a knock on Thomas's motel room door, and when he opened it, he found Sarah Collins standing there with her arm in a sling and her face still pale from her ordeal. "Sarah," Thomas said, shocked to see her. "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in the hospital?" "They released me this morning," she said. "I came here because I wanted to thank you properly and to make sure you were okay. I heard about what happened at the police station, and I'm furious about how you were treated." Thomas invited her into his room, and they sat at the small table by the window. Sarah looked tired but determined. "Thomas," she said, "I want you to know that I've talked to everyone I can think of about what you did. I've spoken to the newspaper, the radio station, my friends, my family, and anyone else who will listen. I'm not going to let anyone forget that you saved my life or pretend that you're anything other than a hero." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out several newspaper clippings. "Look at this," she said, spreading them on the table. "The story has been picked up by newspapers in 3 different cities. People are calling you a hero, Thomas. Real people who understand what you did." Thomas looked at the headlines. "Apache man risks life to save stranger in. Blizzard and Native American hero faces prejudice after rescue." The articles told the story accurately and painted Thomas in a positive light, but he felt uncomfortable seeing his name and picture in the papers. "I didn't do this for attention," Thomas said quietly. "I just did what anyone should do." But that's exactly why this story is so important, Sarah replied. You did what most people wouldn't do, and then you were treated like a criminal because of your race. People need to hear about this. Over the next few days, the story continued to spread. Thomas received letters from people across the state, thanking him for his courage and expressing shame about how he had been treated. Native American organizations reached out to offer their support. Even some white community leaders spoke out against the way Deputy Morrison had handled the investigation. But not everyone was supportive. Thomas also received hate mail from people who thought he was lying or trying to make Native Americans look good. Some letters contained racial slurs and threats. A few people called the motel and left angry messages saying that Indians couldn't be trusted and that Sarah must be confused about what really happened. The attention began to wear on Thomas. He had come to Glacier Falls to spend quiet time with his dying grandmother, not to become the center of a controversy about race relations. But every time he considered leaving town early, he thought about his grandmother's words about planting seeds of understanding. One afternoon, Thomas was surprised by another visitor. A young Native American woman named Maria Spotted Eagle knocked on his door. She introduced herself as a social worker from the reservation and explained that she had driven through the dangerous roads to meet him. Thomas, Maria said, you probably don't realize how important this story has become for our people. Native Americans across the country are talking about what you did. For once, we have a story that shows us as heroes instead of victims or villains. Maria explained that she worked with young Native American men who struggled with self-esteem and identity issues. Many of them had grown up feeling ashamed of their heritage because of the negative stereotypes they encountered in school and in the media. Your story gives them something to be proud of, Maria said. It shows them that being Apache means something good. It shows them that our traditional values of helping others and showing courage are still important in the modern world. Thomas hadn't thought about his actions having this kind of impact. He had simply done what felt right in the moment. But Maria helped him understand that his choices had meaning beyond just saving Sarah's life. There's something else, Maria continued. We're organizing a ceremony to honor you at the reservation. The tribal council wants to officially recognize your actions and what they represent about our people's character. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the idea of a ceremony in his honor. I don't think I deserve all this attention, he said. What I did wasn't special. It's what any decent person should do. That's exactly why you deserve the attention, Maria replied. You don't see yourself as special, but you acted with the kind of courage and compassion that our ancestors would be proud of. You proved that being Apache means something good in this world. The ceremony was scheduled for the following weekend, after the roads were completely clear. Thomas agreed to attend, though he still felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. Meanwhile, the situation in Glacier Falls continued to evolve. Deputy Morrison had become increasingly uncomfortable, as more people learned about how he had handled the investigation. The town's mayor received several complaints about Morrison's conduct, and there were calls for him to apologize publicly to Thomas. The local newspaper ran an editorial criticizing the police department's handling of the case. The editor wrote that Morrison's assumptions about Thomas were based on racial prejudice rather than evidence, and that this kind of thinking had no place in modern law enforcement. Morrison's supervisor, Sheriff Williams, was an older man who had worked in law enforcement for 30 years. He had seen how prejudice could cloud judgment and lead to serious mistakes. After reviewing Morrison's report and interviewing several witnesses, Sheriff Williams decided that changes needed to be made. Sheriff Williams visited Thomas at the motel one afternoon. Unlike Morrison, Williams was respectful and professional from the moment he introduced himself. Mr. Whitehorse, Williams said, I want to personally apologize for how you were treated during our investigation. Deputy Morrison's handling of this case was inappropriate and not reflective of our department's values. Thomas appreciated the apology, but he was more interested in making sure this kind of thing didn't happen to other Native Americans in the future. Sheriff Williams, he said, I don't want this to be just about me. I want to make sure other people don't face the same kind of prejudice. I understand your concern, Williams replied. That's actually why I'm here. I'd like to invite you to speak to our officers about cultural sensitivity and the importance of treating all citizens fairly, regardless of their background. Thomas was surprised by the invitation. The idea of teaching police officers about Native American culture and the dangers of racial profiling seemed like it could make a real difference. He agreed to consider it. That evening, Thomas called his grandmother to tell her about Sheriff Williams's visit. She listened carefully as he described the sheriff's apology and the invitation to speak to the police officers. "This is a good opportunity, grandson," she said. "You have a chance to teach people something important. But remember, change happens slowly. Don't expect to change everyone's mind with one speech." "What should I tell them, grandmother?" "Tell them about who we really are," she replied. "Tell them about Apache values of courage, honesty, and helping others. Help them understand that we are not the stereotypes they might believe." The next day, Thomas met with Sheriff Williams and several other officials to plan his presentation to the police department. They decided that Thomas would speak at the next monthly training meeting, which would be attended by all officers in the department. As word spread about Thomas's upcoming presentation, the story took on new dimensions. Local civil rights organizations offered to help. The tribal council expressed strong support for Thomas's efforts to improve relationships between law enforcement and Native Americans. Sarah Collins also played an important role in these developments. As a nurse who was well respected in the community, her voice carried weight with many white residents of Glacier Falls. She spoke at several community meetings, sharing her story and emphasizing that Thomas's rescue had saved her life. "I owe everything to Thomas Whitehorse," Sarah told a packed town hall meeting. "He risked his own life for a complete stranger, and instead of being celebrated, he was treated with suspicion because of his race. That's not the kind of community I want to live in." Sarah's words had a powerful impact on many people who attended the meeting. Some admitted that they had harbored prejudiced attitudes toward Native Americans without really thinking about it. Others shared stories of positive interactions they had had with Native people that contradicted the negative stereotypes. But the meeting also revealed how deep some prejudices ran. A few people stood up to argue that Native Americans couldn't be trusted, citing old stories and outdated stereotypes. One man claimed that Thomas must have had ulterior motives for rescuing Sarah, and that his kind always had hidden agendas. These comments made Thomas angry, but they also strengthened his resolve to continue working for understanding between different communities. He realized that his grandmother had been right about change happening slowly, and that it would take patience and persistence to make a real difference. As the day of the ceremony at the reservation approached, Thomas reflected on everything that had happened since that night in the blizzard. What had started as a simple act of helping someone in need had grown into something much larger. He had become a symbol of the good that could happen when people put aside their prejudices and saw each other as human beings. But Thomas also understood that symbols could be fragile things. The real test would be whether the attention and discussion generated by his story would lead to lasting changes in how people treated each other. He hoped that his experience would help other Native Americans be seen as individuals rather than stereotypes, and that it would encourage more people to help others regardless of race or background. The ceremony at the reservation took place on a clear, cold Saturday morning. The sky was a brilliant blue and the snow sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. Thomas arrived early and was amazed to see how many people had gathered to honor him. The ceremony was held in the community center, which was decorated with traditional Apache symbols and colors. Tribal elders sat in a circle at the front of the room, wearing their ceremonial clothing. Thomas recognized many faces from his childhood, people who had known his grandmother for decades. Thomas's grandmother sat in the place of honor, despite her illness. She looked frail but proud, her eyes shining with joy as she watched her grandson being recognized by their people. Thomas knelt beside her chair before the ceremony began. "Grandmother," he said softly, "none of this would have happened without your teachings." She placed her weathered hand on his cheek. "You have made our ancestors proud, Thomas. You showed the world what it means to be Apache." The ceremony began with traditional prayers and songs. The tribal chairman, Robert Crow Feather, spoke about the importance of Thomas's actions and what they represented for Native American people everywhere. Thomas Whitehorse did not just save one woman's life, Crow Feather said to the assembled crowd. He saved the honor of our people. He showed that Apache values of courage and compassion are still alive in the modern world. Several people spoke during the ceremony, including Maria Spotted Eagle. who talked about how Thomas's story was inspiring young Native Americans across the country. Sarah Collins had also driven to the reservation to attend the ceremony, despite the long journey and her recent ordeal. When Sarah stood to speak, the room fell silent. Many of the Apache people had never met her before, but they knew she was the woman whose life Thomas had saved. "I am alive today because Thomas Whitehorse chose warmth over shame," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. "When he saw that helping me might cause him problems, he chose to help anyway. That's the kind of person he is, and that's the kind of people you are." Sarah's words brought tears to many eyes, including Thomas's. He realized that she understood something important about what had happened that night. It hadn't just been about saving her life. It had been about choosing to do the right thing even when it was difficult and dangerous. The most meaningful part of the ceremony came when Thomas's grandmother slowly stood up, helped by two tribal elders. Despite her weakness, she insisted on speaking to honor her grandson. "My grandson learned the old ways," she said, in a voice that was soft but carried to every corner of the room. "He learned that helping others is more important than protecting yourself. He learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of fear." She paused to catch her breath, and Thomas started to stand to help her, but she waved him back down. "But most importantly," she continued, "he learned that our Apache heritage is something to be proud of, not something to hide from." When the white woman needed help, Thomas did not think about what people might say about an Indian helping a white person. He only thought about saving a life. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of a traditional Apache war shield to Thomas, symbolizing his courage and the protection he had provided to someone in need. The shield was painted with symbols representing strength, compassion, and the unity of all people. After the ceremony, there was a feast with traditional foods and modern dishes. People shared stories and laughed together. Thomas was overwhelmed by the warmth and support he felt from his community. As the day continued, Thomas learned that his story had spread even further than he had realized. Representatives from several Native American organizations had attended the ceremony, and they spoke about using Thomas's story to promote better understanding between different racial communities. But the most important moment came late in the afternoon, when Thomas sat quietly with his grandmother while the festivities continued around them. She was tired from the day's events, but her eyes were bright with satisfaction. "Grandmother," Thomas said, "do you think this will really make a difference? Will people change the way they think about Native Americans?" She smiled and took his hand. "Change is like a river, grandson. It happens slowly, one drop at a time. Your story is one drop in that river. Maybe a small child will hear about what you did and grow up thinking differently about Apache people. Maybe a police officer will remember your story the next time he meets a Native American. Maybe a teacher will tell her students about the Apache man who risked his life for a stranger." Over the following months, Thomas's story did indeed continue to spread and have impact. He spoke at the police training session in Glacier Falls, where he shared Apache history and values with the officers. Several of them, including Deputy Morrison, seemed genuinely moved by his presentation and committed to examining their own prejudices. Thomas also spoke at schools, community centers, and universities across the region. Each time he told his story, he emphasized that he was just one person doing what anyone should do, but that people's reactions to his actions revealed important truths about prejudice and courage. Sarah Collins became a close friend and ally in these efforts. She often spoke alongside Thomas, sharing her perspective on the rescue and the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their race. Their friendship became a powerful symbol of how people from different backgrounds could work together for positive change. The most lasting impact, however, was on Thomas himself. The experience taught him that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences, and that standing up for what was right was always worth the risk. He carried these lessons with him for the rest of his life. Years later, when Thomas became a father, he told his children the story of that cold night in Glacier Falls. He taught them the same values his grandmother had taught him, that helping others is the most important thing a person can do, that courage means acting despite fear, and that their Apache heritage was something to be proud of. And whenever his children asked him why he had risked his life for a stranger, Thomas would smile and repeat his grandmother's words. That's what makes us human. The story of Thomas Whitehorse and Sarah Collins became part of local history, told and retold as an example of how one person's courage could challenge prejudice and bring communities together. But for Thomas, the most important part of the story was not the attention or recognition it brought him. The most important part was knowing that when someone needed help, he had chosen warmth over shame, courage over fear, and compassion over prejudice in the end. That choice had saved more than just one woman's life. It had saved a piece of faith in the basic goodness of humanity.